The 15th century was a time of great change and exploration. Europe, with its well-established kingdoms and expanding empires, was on the verge of embarking on one of the most transformative periods in human history, the Age of Exploration. Spurred by a thirst for wealth, the pursuit of new trade routes, and the desire to spread Christianity, European monarchs, sailors, and navigators sought to break free from the confines of the known world. Among these ambitious individuals was a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus, whose name would forever be associated with one of the most consequential voyages in world history. Born in 1451 in the bustling port city of Genoa, Italy, Columbus grew up in a world where maritime trade and exploration were integral to the economies and politics of Mediterranean Europe. His early years were marked by a fascination with the sea, which led him to pursue a career as a sailor and navigator. During this time, European nations such as Spain, Portugal, and England were beginning to explore the possibility of reaching distant lands to the east. The main objective was clear: to find new routes to Asia and its wealth of spices, silk, and other exotic goods that had long been highly coveted in Europe. This was the backdrop against which Columbus would begin to carve out his own destiny. However, Columbus was not alone in his quest. By the time he set out on his famous voyage, European nations were engaged in intense competition for overseas exploration and trade. The Portuguese, under the guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator, had already established a series of successful expeditions along the west coast of Africa. They were closing in on a sea route to India that would bypass the overland Silk Road and its dangerous and lengthy journey. In contrast, Columbus' ambition lay in finding a westward passage to Asia, a route he believed would be more direct and less fraught with the challenges posed by the African coastline. This vision was based on his understanding of ancient texts, his interpretation of geographic principles, and his belief that the Earth was much smaller than many of his contemporaries thought. Central to Columbus' ambitions was the belief that the Earth was a sphere, not flat as was commonly believed in some quarters. This idea had gained traction through the writings of classical scholars such as Ptolemy and the work of more recent European thinkers. Columbus, however, took this theory a step further by claiming that a westward route would lead to the islands of Asia. He believed that by sailing west, one could reach the distant shores of the East Indies, bypassing the long and perilous route around Africa. This bold assumption, while incorrect in some respects, was based on a mix of geographical speculation and misinterpretation of the known world at the time. Columbus' vision was ambitious but fraught with risks. His calculations were based on the premise that the Earth was smaller than it actually is, leading him to underestimate the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. He believed that the journey westward would take only a few thousand miles, when in reality, it was far greater. Despite these miscalculations, Columbus remained resolute in his belief that he could succeed where others had failed. He was not deterred by the skepticism of many prominent scholars and navigators of his time, who rejected his theory as overly optimistic and impractical. Instead, Columbus pressed on, determined to find a patron who would support his ambitious voyage. At the time, Spain was embroiled in a series of political and military struggles. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had recently completed the Reconquista, driving the Moors out of Spain and securing their reign over the Iberian Peninsula. With their kingdom unified, the Spanish monarchs were now turning their attention toward expanding their influence abroad. The promise of discovering new lands, wealth, and trade routes was an alluring proposition. Columbus, recognizing this, approached the Spanish court with his proposal for a westward voyage, hoping to secure royal backing for his plan. He believed that the Spanish crown was the perfect sponsor for his endeavor, given their desire to extend Spain's influence and wealth. Columbus' proposal, however, was not immediately embraced. For years, he made repeated attempts to gain the support of the Spanish monarchs, who were initially reluctant to commit to such a high-risk venture. Spain, at the time, was focused on consolidating its power within Europe, and the idea of sending an expedition across the vast, unknown Atlantic seemed far-fetched. Columbus was rejected by the court on multiple occasions, with many questioning the feasibility of his voyage and doubting the accuracy of his calculations. Despite these setbacks, Columbus persisted, driven by his unwavering conviction that the reward for his efforts would be immense. It was only after several years of persistence, fueled by his passion and the political climate in Spain, that Columbus finally won the favor of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. In 1492, after much negotiation, Columbus secured a formal agreement with the Spanish crown, which promised him funding, ships, and a crew for his voyage. This historic moment marked the beginning of one of the most consequential journeys in human history. Columbus, with his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, set sail from Spain, confident that he would find the elusive westward route to Asia. The age of exploration, which Columbus was a part of, was driven by many factors. The promise of wealth, the pursuit of knowledge, and the desire for expansion were powerful motivators that pushed many to venture into the unknown. Columbus' ambition to chart a new course to Asia was part of this larger wave of exploration that was reshaping the world. Though his voyage would ultimately lead him not to Asia, but to the islands of the Caribbean, Columbus' journey became a turning point in history, one that would reshape the globe in ways that no one could have anticipated. In understanding Columbus' story, it is important to recognize the larger context in which his ambitions unfolded. The age of exploration was not just about discovery, but also about the changing tides of global power, economic interests, and cultural exchange. Columbus' journey, though flawed in some of its assumptions, marked the beginning of a new era of global interaction, one that would bring Europe into contact with the Americas and initiate a series of historical events that would have profound consequences for both the Old World and the New World. His story is a testament to the power of ambition, perseverance, and the human desire to chart new territories, even in the face of great uncertainty. Christopher Columbus' path to the Spanish court was neither swift nor simple. His journey, both literal and metaphorical, was marked by determination, missteps, and a series of rejections that shaped his eventual success. Born into a humble family in Genoa, Columbus was no nobleman, and he lacked the connections and resources that often propelled explorers of his time. However, what he lacked in status, he made up for with an unwavering belief in his abilities and a deep conviction that his vision of a westward route to Asia could become a reality. To understand how Columbus reached Spain and ultimately gained the support of the Spanish crown, one must examine his early career, his time in Portugal, and the political and intellectual forces that shaped his worldview. Columbus' early life in Genoa was shaped by the city's position as a major maritime power. The son of a weaver, Columbus did not inherit wealth or noble status, but his exposure to the bustling trade networks and seafaring traditions of Genoa had a profound influence on him. From a young age, he was fascinated with the sea, and he eventually became a sailor and merchant. Columbus' early career took him along the coasts of the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic, where he gained vital experience that would later inform his plans for transatlantic navigation. His voyages as a young man would introduce him to the principles of navigation and the realities of long-distance travel, knowledge he would build upon in his later endeavors. However, Columbus did not remain in Genoa for long. In the early 1470s, he moved to Portugal, which was rapidly becoming one of the most important maritime nations in Europe. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portugal had established a network of explorers and cartographers dedicated to finding new routes to Africa and Asia. This environment of innovation and exploration seemed like the perfect place for Columbus to pursue his ambitions. He arrived in Lisbon with the aim of gaining royal patronage for his planned voyage westward. Columbus quickly immersed himself in Portugal's vibrant maritime community, joining expeditions along the coast of Africa and observing the advancements in navigation that were shaping the era. While Columbus was gaining experience in Portugal, the country's explorers, particularly those sponsored by Prince Henry, were focused on seeking a sea route to India around the southern tip of Africa. The Portuguese were keenly interested in exploring Africa's west coast and beyond, and their efforts were beginning to yield fruit. In 1487, Bartolomé Dias successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that a sea route to the Indian Ocean was possible. This success further entrenched Portugal's commitment to eastern exploration and left little room for Columbus' alternative vision of a westward route. Columbus, however, remained undeterred by Portugal's success, convinced that his westward plan was viable, though few shared his optimism. In the 1480s, Columbus began to present his theories of a westward passage to Asia to prominent figures in Portugal's royal court. He believed that the Earth was smaller than commonly believed, and thus, Asia could be reached by sailing directly westward from Europe. He based his calculations on his own understanding of geography, as well as the writings of ancient scholars, which he interpreted in a way that led him to underestimate the distance between Europe and Asia. He also misjudged the size of the oceans and the locations of islands in the Atlantic. Despite presenting these ideas to the Portuguese court, Columbus was met with skepticism and rejection. The prevailing view among many European scholars and navigators was that Columbus' assumptions about the size of the Earth and the distance to Asia were far too optimistic. In 1484, after failing to secure support for his plan in Portugal, Columbus turned to another option: Spain. The Spanish crown, having recently completed the Reconquista with the capture of Granada from the Moors, was now looking outward, eager to expand its influence and wealth. Columbus saw this as an opportunity to present his bold proposal to a new set of monarchs. Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon had united their kingdoms and were beginning to consider new ventures, including exploration. Spain, unlike Portugal, had not yet embarked on a concerted effort to find a sea route to Asia, which made it a fertile ground for Columbus' ideas. At first, Columbus' approach to the Spanish court was not immediately successful. In 1486, he presented his proposal to the Spanish monarchs, offering them the opportunity to sponsor his westward voyage. However, Columbus faced significant challenges in convincing Isabella and Ferdinand to take him seriously. They were already focused on domestic matters and cautious about financing such an uncertain venture. The Spanish court, like the Portuguese one before it, was skeptical of Columbus' claims, especially given his lack of formal education and the unproven nature of his theories. Furthermore, the cost of outfitting an expedition to sail westward was high, and the risks of such a venture were not lost on the monarchs. Undeterred, Columbus continued to press his case, appealing to the Spanish monarchs' desire to extend their empire and increase their wealth. He argued that by reaching Asia through the west, Spain could gain access to the lucrative trade in spices, silks, and other valuable commodities, which were controlled by the Arab traders who monopolized the land routes to the east. Columbus also emphasized the potential for spreading Christianity to the farthest reaches of the globe, an argument that resonated with the deeply religious Isabella and Ferdinand. These two factors, economic gain and religious expansion, were powerful incentives that Columbus used to persuade the Spanish crown. In 1492, after years of negotiation and persistence, Columbus finally received a hearing before the Spanish court. It was a pivotal moment in history, as the monarchs of Spain, after much deliberation, agreed to sponsor Columbus' voyage. On April 17, 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand signed the Capitulations of Santa Fe, a document that granted Columbus the authority to seek new lands and trade routes in the name of Spain. In exchange, Columbus would be granted titles of nobility and a share of the riches that his discoveries would yield. The agreement marked a turning point in Columbus' life and the history of exploration, as it provided the resources and official backing for his expedition. Columbus' decision to seek royal patronage in Spain, rather than remain in Portugal, proved to be a defining moment. It allowed him to achieve the financial backing and legitimacy he needed to embark on his historic voyage. His perseverance in the face of rejection and skepticism ultimately paid off. While his journey would not immediately lead to the discovery of a westward passage to Asia, it would change the world in ways that no one, not even Columbus himself, could have predicted. His arrival in the New World in 1492 would set in motion a series of events that would reshape the globe, beginning with the establishment of contact between Europe and the Americas. Columbus' road to Spain, marked by rejection and persistence, reveals much about his character and the world he inhabited. It underscores his ability to navigate complex political and intellectual landscapes, as well as his unwavering belief in his vision. The path he traveled was not a straight line, but one that required him to adapt to the shifting tides of opportunity and failure. Columbus' eventual success in securing Spanish support for his voyage was a testament to his resilience and determination, and it marked the beginning of a new era of exploration that would forever alter the course of history. The idea that Christopher Columbus could find a westward route to Asia was revolutionary, even though it was rooted in a blend of old and new geographical theories. Columbus did not simply rely on his personal ambition to fuel his journey. Rather, his vision was grounded in a mix of historical knowledge, intellectual traditions, and speculative assumptions about the world's geography. To understand Columbus' proposal, it is essential to explore the intellectual and cultural climate of his time, how he arrived at his conclusions, and the factors that led him to believe that a westward route to Asia was possible. One of the key factors shaping Columbus' vision was his study of classical works, particularly the writings of ancient scholars like Ptolemy. The Greek astronomer and geographer Claudius Ptolemy's Geographia, a synthesis of the world's known geography, was influential in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Ptolemy's maps, although incomplete, presented the world as a sphere, with continents and oceans arranged in ways that were familiar to Columbus. However, what Ptolemy did not foresee was the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean and the existence of the Americas, which Columbus would later encounter. Nevertheless, Columbus was convinced that the Earth was smaller than other scholars believed, and this assumption led him to formulate his westward route to Asia. Another intellectual influence on Columbus was the work of Italian humanists, particularly the writings of Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, a Florentine mathematician and astronomer. In the late 15th century, Toscanelli corresponded with Columbus and supported the idea of a westward route to Asia. Toscanelli had calculated that the distance between Europe and Asia by traveling westward across the Atlantic was shorter than the distance by the traditional eastern route through the Mediterranean and around Africa. Although Toscanelli's estimates were wrong and oversimplified, Columbus found his ideas compelling and adopted them as the foundation for his own plans. It was through this intellectual correspondence that Columbus began to solidify his belief that he could reach Asia by sailing westward from Spain. Columbus also drew on ancient maritime traditions, which had long believed that the ocean was navigable. Sailors had long navigated the Mediterranean and the coasts of Europe and Africa, but the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean remained largely unexplored. Ancient mariners had sailed into the Atlantic, and while their journeys had been short, they suggested that the sea beyond Europe might hold unknown territories. Columbus, however, was convinced that these distant lands were part of the Asian continent. His plan was to bypass the traditional Mediterranean routes and the perilous journey around the African continent by traveling directly west across the vast, unknown waters of the Atlantic. One of the most significant elements of Columbus' vision was his estimation of the Earth's size. While most scholars of his time accepted the teachings of Aristotle and the Ptolemaic system, which suggested that the Earth was significantly larger than Columbus believed, he held that the world was smaller and that the distance to Asia by a westward route was much shorter than the distance to the east. Columbus miscalculated the circumference of the Earth by several thousand miles, a mistake that would later contribute to his underestimation of the actual challenges his voyage would face. Despite his errors, Columbus remained steadfast in his conviction that the Earth was smaller than other scholars had argued, and that a westward voyage could be the key to unlocking new trade routes. Columbus also believed that his journey was backed by divine providence. In the religious climate of late 15th century Spain, the idea of divine support for an enterprise like Columbus was essential. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, were deeply religious, having completed the Reconquista and ousted the Moors from Spain. Columbus, too, saw his mission as one that would serve God's will, particularly in spreading Christianity to the farthest corners of the earth. In his letters and proposals, Columbus often spoke of his desire to convert non-Christians, and this religious motivation played a key role in his persistence in pursuing royal support. For Columbus, the westward voyage was not just a commercial or scientific endeavor, but also a holy mission. Despite the faith Columbus placed in his vision, his understanding of geography was flawed in several crucial ways. One of the most significant errors was his belief that Asia lay much closer to Europe than it actually did. Columbus believed that the distance from Spain to Asia across the Atlantic was only about 2,400 miles. However, in reality, the distance between Spain and the nearest part of Asia via the Pacific Ocean was far greater, more than 12,000 miles. Columbus did not account for the size of the Americas, which lay in between Europe and Asia, and he also underestimated the challenges of navigating the open ocean. To further bolster his argument, Columbus made use of the popular, albeit incorrect, belief that the Earth's northern and southern latitudes were consistent. This was a key assumption in his calculations, which suggested that the longitude of Asia could be reached by sailing westward. In reality, Columbus' failure to account for the uncharted islands and the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean meant that he was sailing into the unknown, unaware that a vast landmass, what we now know as the Americas, lay directly in his path. His disregard for the possibility of unknown continents and his confidence in his geographical model ultimately led him into the history books, albeit in a way that was far from what he had envisioned. Despite these errors, Columbus' determination to pursue his vision was unshaken. His persistence in seeking financial backing for his voyage from the Portuguese and later the Spanish monarchs demonstrates his deep belief that he could succeed in his quest. Columbus did not merely propose a voyage. He painted a picture of the potential riches and glory that Spain could acquire by claiming a westward route to Asia. He offered promises of immense wealth, as well as the potential for Spanish dominion over vast and unexplored territories. To Columbus, his vision was not just about personal ambition, but about the glory of Spain and the spread of Christianity. Columbus' vision of a westward passage to Asia was not just a product of flawed geography, but also a culmination of a particular worldview. The idea that Columbus could sail westward to reach Asia was a perfect storm of intellectual miscalculations, religious zeal, and a spirit of adventure. It was a vision that captured the imagination of an age that was eager to expand its influence and explore the unknown. Columbus' ability to convince the Spanish crown to fund his voyage was, in many ways, the result of his compelling articulation of the potential benefits of his vision, a vision that blended ambition, geography, and religious zeal into a singular, historic pursuit. In the end, Columbus' vision of a westward route to Asia would lead him to lands he never anticipated, lands that would become known as the Americas. Though his calculations were inaccurate, his journey set in motion the European colonization of the New World and fundamentally altered the course of world history. Columbus' proposal, though based on flawed assumptions, ultimately reshaped the world's understanding of geography, initiating a new era of exploration that would bring Europe into contact with the Americas in ways that no one could have imagined. Christopher Columbus' relentless pursuit of his vision, a westward route to Asia, would not have come to fruition without the crucial support of the Spanish crown. His ability to secure this backing marked a turning point in his quest, transforming his theoretical plans into a tangible project. The decision of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain to sponsor Columbus' voyage was a complex one, shaped by both practical concerns and broader geopolitical and economic motivations. Understanding the factors that led the Spanish monarchs to commit to Columbus' ambitious endeavor requires an examination of the political climate of Spain in the late 15th century, as well as the personal and ideological influences that shaped their decision-making. In the late 1400s, Spain was undergoing significant political and military changes. The Reconquista, which culminated in the capture of Granada in 1492, had unified the Iberian Peninsula under the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. After nearly 800 years of Islamic rule in parts of Spain, the completion of the Reconquista marked the end of Muslim influence in the region and solidified Christian dominance. This victory was not only a religious triumph, but also a key moment in the formation of a unified Spanish state. The Spanish monarchs, having secured their kingdom from internal conflict, were now looking outward, seeking ways to expand their influence and power beyond the borders of the peninsula. At the same time, Spain's economic and political interests were intertwined with its desire to compete with other European powers, particularly Portugal. Portugal had already established itself as a leader in maritime exploration, especially under the guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator, whose expeditions along the west coast of Africa had brought new trade routes and colonies under Portuguese control. Portugal's success in finding an eastern sea route to Asia, around the Cape of Good Hope, threatened Spain's ambitions to establish its own lucrative trade routes to the east. The competition between Spain and Portugal for control of global trade was a driving force behind Columbus' appeal to the Spanish crown. By offering Columbus the possibility of an alternative westward route to Asia, the Spanish monarchs saw an opportunity to claim the wealth and power that would result from being the first to establish such a route. However, the decision to support Columbus was not an easy one. Spain, having just emerged victorious from the Reconquista, was still grappling with the aftermath of the war and the financial strains it had placed on the kingdom. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were cautious about committing their limited resources to such a high-risk venture. The idea of sponsoring an expedition to sail westward into uncharted waters seemed like a daunting gamble, especially since many of Spain's advisors and scholars dismissed Columbus' theories as unrealistic. For years, Columbus had been rejected by the Portuguese court, and many of the most prominent intellectuals of the time considered his calculations to be flawed. Columbus' persistence, however, played a pivotal role in shifting the Spanish monarch's stance. Having initially been turned away in 1486, Columbus returned to the Spanish court multiple times, continuing to present his case. His persistence paid off in 1491, when Columbus was granted an audience with the Spanish monarchs. At this meeting, he was finally able to present his arguments in person, emphasizing the potential economic benefits of reaching Asia by sailing westward. Columbus made the case that Spain could bypass the overland routes controlled by the Arab world, gaining direct access to the rich markets of India, China, and the Spice Islands. To persuade the Spanish crown further, Columbus framed his proposal in terms of not just trade, but also religion. He argued that his voyage could lead to the conversion of non-Christians in the East, thus advancing the cause of Christianity. For Queen Isabella, a devout Catholic who had fought to expel the Moors from Spain, this religious appeal was especially compelling. The idea that Columbus' voyage could help spread Christianity and extend Spanish influence around the world was a powerful argument. Isabella, who had a strong interest in promoting her country's religious and political power, found Columbus' combination of economic and religious justifications appealing. The decision to fund Columbus was also influenced by the larger context of Spain's ambitions in global exploration and expansion. The late 15th century was a time of increasing global competition. Spain, now united under Ferdinand and Isabella, was eager to assert itself as a global power. The prospect of establishing a new route to Asia was an enticing one, not just for its potential wealth, but for its ability to elevate Spain to the status of a dominant empire. Columbus' proposal, though speculative, offered a chance for Spain to secure a powerful position in the world's emerging global economy. For Ferdinand and Isabella, backing Columbus was a way to ensure that their kingdom would not be left behind in the race for overseas dominance. It is important to note that while Columbus had finally gained the support of the Spanish crown, the monarchs did not immediately grant him everything he requested. The capitulations of Santa Fe, the formal agreement signed in April 1492, provided Columbus with the resources and authority to undertake his voyage, but it also placed significant conditions on his role and future claims. Columbus was promised a substantial share of any riches that he would discover, as well as titles and privileges, but he was not granted absolute control. The Spanish crown retained the ultimate authority over the lands he would encounter, and Columbus was required to report back to the monarchs with any findings. This agreement would establish the terms of Columbus' authority and his relationship with the Spanish crown throughout his journey. Columbus' ability to convince Isabella and Ferdinand to back his voyage can be understood in the context of the political and economic landscape of Spain at the time. The monarchs were not only looking to expand their influence, but were also keen on securing a trade route that would bypass the monopolies held by other European powers, especially the Portuguese. Columbus' proposal presented a bold, though risky, opportunity to achieve these goals. In this sense, his vision aligned well with Spain's broader objectives of economic growth, political power, and religious expansion. In the end, the decision to sponsor Columbus was a calculated one. While the monarchs were aware of the risks, they were also aware of the potential rewards. The possibility of securing a new route to Asia, bringing wealth to Spain, and extending Christian dominion made Columbus' plan too enticing to dismiss entirely. By agreeing to fund the expedition, Isabella and Ferdinand made a pivotal decision that would forever change the course of history. The Spanish crown's support, driven by a mix of economic, religious, and political considerations, would enable Columbus to embark on his historic journey across the Atlantic. Columbus' success in gaining the backing of the Spanish crown highlights his ability to align his goals with the broader interests of the monarchs. His persistence, his appeals to both economic and religious motivations, and his understanding of Spain's geopolitical context were key to his success. This decision would not only set Columbus on a path to the New World, but also mark the beginning of an era of exploration that would forever alter the global landscape. The sponsorship of Columbus' voyage was a defining moment in history, one that set the stage for the age of European imperialism and the global interactions that followed. The decision by Ferdinand and Isabella to sponsor Columbus' voyage in 1492 marked the beginning of the intense logistical and administrative work required to transform his vision into reality. Columbus, having secured royal patronage, now faced the formidable challenge of preparing for an expedition that would involve navigating unknown seas, uncharted territories, and a voyage that had never before been attempted. The preparations for this historic journey were complex and multifaceted, involving the acquisition of ships, securing crews, organizing provisions, and navigating the political and social challenges that arose. These preparations were essential not only for the success of the expedition, but also for laying the foundation of what would become the Age of Exploration. One of the first and most significant tasks in preparing for the voyage was the acquisition of ships. Columbus needed vessels that were capable of enduring long voyages across the Atlantic. The three ships that were ultimately selected, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, were relatively small by today's standards but suitable for the mission at hand. The Santa Maria was Columbus' flagship and the largest of the three ships, a carrack that was sturdy enough to navigate the open sea. The Pinta and the Nina were caravels, smaller, more maneuverable vessels that were well suited for exploration, particularly along coasts. The selection of these ships was crucial, as the design of the vessels had to account for the harsh conditions of the Atlantic Ocean, including rough seas and long stretches without sight of land. The procurement of the ships was not without challenges. Columbus' proposal had to be supported by more than just the royal backing. Practical resources had to be marshaled to equip the ships with the necessary provisions, and the ships themselves had to be prepared for a voyage of uncertain length. In addition to the ships themselves, Columbus needed skilled navigators, sailors, and carpenters to ensure that the vessels were seaworthy. The crews that Columbus recruited were a mix of experienced sailors, criminals who were offered pardons in exchange for service, and common men seeking adventure. The crew's motivation for joining the expedition was varied, but the promise of riches, the thrill of exploration, and the religious fervor associated with spreading Christianity were all factors that Columbus exploited in his recruitment efforts. While Columbus focused on the technical and personnel aspects of the expedition, he also had a plan for the logistical challenges of such a lengthy voyage. Provisions were another critical element in the preparations. The crew would need enough food, water, and supplies to sustain them for a potentially long journey. Columbus arranged for the ships to carry an extensive supply of salted meat, dried beans, wine, and other staples that would keep the men nourished during their time at sea. Freshwater barrels were also essential, as the ships would be out of sight of land for extended periods. The lack of knowledge about the geography and potential hazards of the voyage made these preparations all the more important. Columbus had to ensure that the ships were equipped for every contingency, from storms at sea to food shortages and mutiny. In addition to the material preparations, Columbus had to consider the political and social dimensions of the expedition. He had secured royal support, but that support came with conditions. Columbus was granted the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, but this title also came with expectations. Columbus would have to answer to the Spanish crown regarding any discoveries made during the voyage, and the monarchs expected regular reports on his progress. The capitulations of Santa Fe, which had formalized the agreement between Columbus and the Spanish crown, outlined not only the rewards Columbus would receive for a successful voyage, but also the terms under which he would operate. The monarchs had a vested interest in ensuring that their investment paid off, and Columbus was under pressure to succeed. Columbus also faced resistance and skepticism from within Spain itself. Many in the Spanish court, including some of the most prominent navigators and scholars, were doubtful of Columbus' theories and questioned whether such an expedition was feasible. The prevailing belief among many of Europe's leading intellectuals was that Columbus' westward route to Asia was not only unlikely, but foolhardy. Many of Columbus' critics believed that he underestimated the size of the Earth and that the distance to Asia was far too great for such a venture to succeed. Despite this opposition, Columbus was able to maintain the support of the Spanish crown, largely due to his persistence and the allure of the potential rewards his expedition could bring to Spain. In addition to logistical and political hurdles, Columbus also had to prepare for the unknown. Unlike other explorers of the time who had mapped out parts of the world with greater certainty, Columbus was venturing into uncharted waters. The very nature of his journey, sailing west across the Atlantic in search of Asia, meant that he had no clear idea of what lay ahead. His expectations were based largely on his miscalculations of the Earth's size and the location of Asia. Columbus believed that he could reach the eastern lands by sailing west, and he was convinced that there were islands in the Atlantic that would serve as stepping stones to the Asian continent. However, the New World was still an unknown and, to him, an unimaginable obstacle. The preparation for the voyage was also marked by Columbus' attempt to rally support from the broader public. While Columbus had secured the necessary backing from the royal family, he needed to convince the Spanish people that his mission was one of immense importance. He emphasized the economic and religious potential of his journey, arguing that it could bring untold wealth to Spain and extend the reach of Christianity to far-flung corners of the earth. Columbus framed his expedition as not only a commercial venture, but a sacred mission to spread Christian teachings to the unknown peoples of Asia. This rhetoric, though exaggerated, was effective in stirring up enthusiasm for the journey among some segments of the Spanish population. By the time the fleet set sail in August 1492, the preparations were complete. Columbus had assembled a crew, secured ships, and gathered supplies, but there were still uncertainties. Would the ships make it across the vast Atlantic? Would they find the promised lands? Or would the journey end in failure, as many had predicted? These questions hung over Columbus and his expedition as they departed from the port of Palos de la Frontera on August 3, 1492, and sailed into the unknown. The success or failure of this journey would not only define Columbus' legacy, but also have profound consequences for the history of Europe, the Americas, and the world. In conclusion, the preparations for Columbus' voyage were an intricate blend of material, logistical, political, and personal challenges. From securing the ships and provisions to navigating the complex relationships with the Spanish crown and dealing with opposition within Spain itself, Columbus' ability to overcome these obstacles was critical to the success of his journey. The preparation process not only highlighted the risks involved in his mission, but also underscored Columbus' determination and ambition to fulfill his vision. His ability to pull together the necessary resources and support for such an uncertain venture speaks to his skills as a navigator, a diplomat, and a visionary. With the preparations in place, Columbus was poised to embark on a journey that would change the course of history forever. The expedition that Columbus embarked upon in 1492 was a journey fraught with uncertainty and risk, but it was also a journey that would change the course of history. As Columbus and his crew set sail from the port of Palos de la Frontera, they entered into the vast unknown of the Atlantic Ocean, a sea that had never before been crossed in such a manner. The expedition marked the beginning of a new era of exploration, but the voyage itself was not without its challenges. Understanding the nature of the voyage, its difficulties, uncertainties, and ultimate impact, requires a closer look at the journey itself, the conditions Columbus and his men faced, and the ways in which they navigated the vast and uncharted waters that lay ahead. The initial departure from Spain was filled with optimism, but as the days and weeks passed, the crew began to grow anxious. The first few days of the voyage were calm and uneventful, but the longer the ship sailed into the unknown, the more uncertainty began to set in. Columbus had promised his crew a short journey, but as the days stretched on, the reality of sailing into an uncharted ocean became apparent. The journey was longer and more exhausting than expected, and the distance to be covered seemed to stretch further into the horizon. The isolation of the sea, with no land in sight, compounded the anxiety felt by the crew. As weeks turned into months, tensions grew among the men, and some began to question the wisdom of Columbus' plan. Columbus, aware of the mounting tension among his crew, resorted to a variety of strategies to maintain morale. One of the most significant tools at his disposal was his ability to promise rewards upon their successful arrival in Asia. He repeatedly assured the men that they would soon reach the fabled lands of India and China. This optimism was crucial in keeping the crew focused and in preventing mutiny, which was a constant threat on long voyages, especially when the destination was unknown. In addition, Columbus kept a close watch on the weather and navigational signs, and when the men became anxious, he would point to the stars or the changing winds to reassure them that they were on the right course. His leadership was marked by a combination of pragmatism and inspiration, though his own belief in the journey never wavered. Despite these efforts, the conditions of the voyage were grueling. The Atlantic Ocean was a formidable adversary, with unpredictable winds and unpredictable currents. The ships were constantly at the mercy of the elements, and the crew had to contend with the dangers of storms, diseases, and the hardships of living on a ship for weeks at a time. The men slept in cramped quarters with little ventilation or privacy. The food supply, though carefully planned, began to dwindle, and the crew was often forced to ration their provisions. These conditions took a physical toll on the men, who grew weary and disheartened as the voyage wore on. The constant tension between optimism and despair underscored the precarious nature of the journey and the risks that Columbus and his men were undertaking. One of the most significant challenges Columbus faced was the growing discontent among his crew. The idea of sailing into the unknown, with no guarantee of success, weighed heavily on the men. After weeks of no land in sight, the murmurs of dissent became louder. The promise of wealth and glory seemed distant, and the fear of disaster began to overshadow the excitement of exploration. In response to this growing unrest, Columbus made the decision to offer a compromise. He promised the crew that if they did not find land within a certain number of days, they would turn back. This promise helped quell some of the dissent, but the tension remained palpable. It was on October 12, 1492, after more than 2 months at sea, that the first signs of land appeared on the horizon. Columbus, who had remained steadfast in his belief that they were nearing the Asian coast, was elated. The crew, weary from their long journey, were equally excited but apprehensive. The land they had sighted, however, was not the distant shores of Asia, but an island in the Bahamas, one that Columbus would later name San Salvador. This moment of discovery marked a crucial turning point in the voyage, for it proved that Columbus had indeed found new lands, but it also revealed the gap between his expectations and the reality of what he had encountered. The land was not Asia, but a previously unknown part of the world, what we now know as the Caribbean. Upon landing, Columbus and his crew were faced with new challenges. The native peoples they encountered were not the wealthy, civilized Asians Columbus had anticipated, but indigenous groups who lived in relative isolation from the rest of the world. Columbus, who had envisioned a quick and profitable venture to the east, was now forced to reconsider his expectations. Nevertheless, he believed that these new lands were part of the Asian continent, and that they held the riches he had sought. He named the indigenous people Indians, based on his assumption that he had reached the outskirts of India, and began efforts to explore and claim the land in the name of Spain. Despite his conviction that he had reached Asia, Columbus did not stay long on the island. He continued his journey, sailing from one island to the next, searching for gold and other valuable resources. The voyage continued to present challenges, from difficult navigation through the islands to encounters with unfamiliar native groups. Columbus' interactions with the indigenous populations were often marked by a mix of curiosity, miscommunication, and a desire to assert Spanish authority over the lands he had encountered. These early encounters would set the stage for the future relationships between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of the Americas, relationships that would prove to be complex and fraught with conflict. In the months that followed, Columbus explored several islands in the Caribbean, including Cuba and Hispaniola, and established a settlement in the latter. However, despite his expectations, he did not find the riches he had anticipated. His encounters with the indigenous peoples were a mixture of cooperation and conflict, as Columbus attempted to forge alliances and secure the wealth he had promised to the Spanish crown. The failure to find gold and other resources led Columbus to become increasingly frustrated, and he struggled to reconcile his mission's goals with the reality he faced on the ground. Despite the hardships of the voyage, Columbus' successful crossing of the Atlantic was a monumental achievement. He had navigated a vast and uncharted ocean, and while he had not reached Asia, he had discovered new lands that would soon be the focus of European colonization. The impact of this discovery was far-reaching, as it would spark a wave of exploration and conquest that would reshape the world. Columbus' voyage opened the door to a new era of European expansion into the Americas, marking the beginning of a transformative period in world history. In conclusion, the voyage of Christopher Columbus was a journey defined by uncertainty, perseverance, and discovery. The challenges faced by Columbus and his crew were many, from the physical hardships of the voyage to the growing dissent among the crew. Yet, despite these difficulties, Columbus' ability to navigate the vast and unknown ocean and to lead his men to the New World remains one of the defining accomplishments of his life. While his initial expectations of reaching Asia were not realized, the discovery of the Americas set in motion a chain of events that would profoundly impact the course of history. The voyage of Columbus was not just a physical journey, but a symbolic one, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the exploration and expansion of the known world. After months of navigating the Caribbean and the islands of the New World, Columbus and his crew finally turned back towards Spain in early 1493. The voyage had been a monumental one, but its return was fraught with complications and unforeseen consequences. The discovery of the Americas, though celebrated by Columbus himself, had not been met with immediate enthusiasm or approval from all quarters. Upon his return to Spain, Columbus faced both the recognition of his achievement and the beginning of serious scrutiny regarding the nature of his discoveries, the conduct of his mission, and the implications of his claims. The aftermath of the voyage was as complex as the journey itself, and the subsequent years were marked by a mix of celebration, controversy, and reflection. The return to Spain itself was both a triumph and a challenge for Columbus. On March 15, 1493, Columbus and his crew arrived back in Palos de la Frontera. They were greeted with great enthusiasm by the Spanish court, as their journey had brought Spain newfound prestige and a potential gateway to vast wealth. Ferdinand and Isabella, who had been anxiously awaiting news of Columbus' journey, received him with honor. Columbus' accomplishments were celebrated, and he was heralded as a hero in the Spanish court. The promise of new territories for Spain, the potential for lucrative trade routes, and the opportunity to spread Christianity all added to the excitement surrounding the discovery. Yet, despite the initial celebrations, Columbus' return was also marked by growing concerns and questions regarding the nature of his discoveries. His reports to the Spanish crown were, by his own admission, somewhat exaggerated. He had claimed to have discovered islands near Asia, populated by the fabled riches of the East. However, the lands he had encountered were far from Asia, and they were inhabited by indigenous peoples whose culture and resources were vastly different from the wealthy civilizations Columbus had imagined. This discrepancy between Columbus' expectations and the reality of what he had found would come to haunt him in the years following his return. Columbus' reports to the Spanish monarchs and the court in Spain were enthusiastic but vague. His letters and accounts spoke of the potential wealth and resources of the lands he had discovered, but he failed to provide a clear and accurate picture of the situation. Columbus had not found the gold and treasures he had promised, nor had he encountered the vast, civilized empires he had anticipated. Nevertheless, he insisted that the islands he had found were part of the Asian continent, and that further exploration would reveal the wealth he had promised. His reports were written in a way that played to the interests of the Spanish crown, appealing to both economic greed and religious zeal. The promise of converting native peoples to Christianity was a particularly strong point for Isabella, who saw the potential for spreading her faith to distant lands. Despite Columbus' claims, it quickly became clear that the reality of the New World did not match his expectations. While Columbus had established a small settlement on Hispaniola, he had found no significant riches, and the indigenous peoples had not yielded the kind of resources or trade goods that he had hoped for. His interactions with the native populations were not always peaceful. Some of his efforts to assert Spanish authority had led to violent encounters, and tensions with the indigenous people were rising. Columbus' inability to deliver on his promises of wealth and treasure put him in a difficult position with the Spanish crown. Though Ferdinand and Isabella had supported him financially and politically, they were beginning to question whether Columbus' claims were overly ambitious or misleading. The growing tensions between Columbus and the Spanish court culminated in a series of investigations into his conduct. In the wake of his return, Columbus was called to account for his actions in the New World. His leadership, particularly in managing the settlement on Hispaniola, came under scrutiny. The colony he had established was struggling, plagued by a lack of supplies, poor relations with the indigenous people, and internal conflicts among the Spanish settlers. Columbus' handling of these challenges was increasingly criticized, as it became clear that his methods were not always effective or sustainable. Additionally, accusations of mismanagement and cruelty began to surface. Columbus was charged with harsh treatment of both the native populations and the Spanish settlers, leading to growing dissatisfaction with his leadership. The Spanish crown, after initially supporting Columbus, began to distance itself from him as the consequences of his discoveries became more apparent. The failed promises of wealth and the increasingly unstable situation in the Caribbean raised doubts about the viability of Columbus' mission. In 1499, Ferdinand and Isabella appointed Francisco de Bobadilla to investigate Columbus' administration of the newly claimed lands. Bobadilla's report, which criticized Columbus' actions and called for the replacement of Columbus as governor, was damning. Columbus was arrested and sent back to Spain in chains in 1500, marking the beginning of a downward trajectory in his career. Though he was eventually released and allowed to return to Spain, Columbus' reputation had been irrevocably tarnished. Despite these setbacks, Columbus was not entirely removed from the spotlight. The Spanish crown still valued the discoveries he had made, and his voyages were seen as pivotal in the expansion of Spain's overseas empire. In 1502, Columbus was granted permission to make a fourth voyage, although his role was significantly reduced, and he no longer had the same level of authority or support from the crown. This final voyage, which took Columbus to the coasts of Central America, was marked by difficulties and further failure to find the riches he had promised. His health was declining, and the sense of hope that had once accompanied his missions had largely evaporated. In the years that followed, Columbus reflected on his voyages with a mixture of pride and frustration. He never fully accepted that he had not reached Asia, and he continued to insist that he had discovered islands that were part of the Asian continent. His journals, letters, and writings from this period reveal a man who remained deeply convinced of his accomplishments, despite the controversies and failures that surrounded him. Columbus' inability to acknowledge the true nature of his discoveries was part of his complex legacy. While he had opened the door for European exploration and colonization of the Americas, he had also left behind a legacy of miscalculation and misunderstanding. The consequences of Columbus' return to Spain were far-reaching. His voyages set in motion the age of exploration, leading to the European colonization of the Americas and the eventual establishment of vast empires. However, they also ushered in an era of exploitation, disease, and violence for the indigenous populations of the New World. Columbus' legacy is thus deeply contested. On the one hand, he is celebrated for his navigational achievements and his role in expanding European horizons. On the other, He is remembered for the devastation his discoveries brought to the native peoples of the Americas. In conclusion, the return of Columbus from his first voyage was a moment of both triumph and disillusionment. While he was hailed as a hero and received the recognition he sought, the reality of his discoveries soon began to undermine his earlier claims. His failure to find the expected riches, the mismanagement of the colonies, and the growing tension with both the Spanish crown and the indigenous populations led to a gradual decline in his power and reputation. The return from his voyage marks a pivotal moment in Columbus' career, where the hope and excitement of his early days as an explorer gave way to the realities of governance, miscalculation, and the complex consequences of his discoveries. Christopher Columbus' voyages in 1492 and subsequent years are widely regarded as a watershed moment in world history. Though Columbus himself never fully understood the full extent of his discoveries, his arrival in the Americas reshaped the course of history in ways that are still felt today. Columbus' legacy is a complex one, marked by both admiration for his navigational skills and the consequences of his encounters with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The ripple effects of his voyages were profound, creating an enduring historical legacy that has shaped modern geopolitics, culture, and global trade. Columbus' impact can first and foremost be seen in the expansion of European knowledge and exploration. Before his voyage, European understanding of the world was limited. The idea that one could sail westward from Europe to reach Asia was an untested theory. Columbus, by daring to embark on his westward journey, broke down the geographical boundaries of the known world. His voyages demonstrated that the Earth could be traversed in new ways, and that there were indeed new lands to explore beyond Europe's immediate horizon. Columbus' successful navigation of the Atlantic opened the door to further European exploration, particularly by Spain and Portugal, and later other European powers such as England, France, and the Netherlands. His expeditions inspired future generations of explorers, including Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan, and John Cabot, whose subsequent voyages expanded European influence around the globe. The discovery of the Americas also had significant geopolitical consequences. Columbus' expeditions marked the beginning of European colonial expansion in the Western Hemisphere, leading to the eventual establishment of European empires in the Americas. In the years following Columbus' voyages, Spain and Portugal, in particular, established vast colonial territories in the New World. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, brokered by the Pope, divided the newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal, solidifying their dominance in global exploration and colonization. Spain's empire would eventually stretch from the southern tip of South America to the southwestern United States, while Portugal's colonies would dominate Brazil and the southern seas. This territorial division would shape the political landscape of the Western Hemisphere for centuries. While Columbus' voyages ushered in an age of European colonialism, they also marked the beginning of a devastating period for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Columbus' initial interactions with the native populations were marked by a mixture of curiosity, misunderstanding, and often outright exploitation. In the early years, Columbus believed the indigenous peoples were potential allies, whom he could use to further the interests of the Spanish crown. However, as Columbus and his successors continued their exploration and colonization of the Americas, the native populations suffered immensely. European diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and measles, to which indigenous peoples had no immunity, spread rapidly, leading to the death of millions. In addition to the ravages of disease, the indigenous peoples were subjected to forced labor, violence, and displacement as European powers established settlements and plantations. Columbus' impact on indigenous populations is particularly contentious. On the one hand, his voyages introduced a new era of interaction between the Old World and the New World. This Columbian exchange had lasting environmental and agricultural consequences, as crops and livestock were exchanged between the two hemispheres. New World crops such as maize, potatoes, and tobacco revolutionized agriculture in Europe, while Old World animals such as horses, cattle, and pigs were introduced to the Americas. However, this exchange also had devastating consequences for the indigenous peoples. The arrival of Europeans was not only a physical invasion, but also an ideological one. The process of European colonization led to the systematic destruction of indigenous cultures, languages, and societies. Columbus, who viewed the native peoples through the lens of his own Eurocentric values, played a role in the early phases of this transformation, setting a precedent for future colonial interactions. Furthermore, the notion of Columbus as a hero or villain has sparked significant debate in modern times. For centuries, Columbus was celebrated as the great discoverer who opened the door to the New World. Statues were erected in his honor, and his name became synonymous with the spirit of exploration. However, in recent years, there has been a reassessment of Columbus' legacy, particularly in light of the negative impact his voyages had on indigenous peoples. Critics argue that Columbus should not be celebrated as a heroic figure, but rather remembered for the damage his voyages caused. The controversial renaming of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day in parts of the United States and elsewhere is a reflection of this shift in perspective. While Columbus undeniably played a crucial role in the shaping of modern history, his legacy is now seen as a double-edged sword, one that requires careful consideration of both his contributions and the devastating consequences of European colonialism. In addition to the physical and cultural destruction brought about by European colonization, Columbus' voyages also marked the beginning of an interconnected global economy. The influx of precious metals, particularly gold and silver, from the Americas into European markets changed the nature of global trade. The establishment of the Atlantic slave trade also became a significant aspect of the European colonial enterprise. Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas to work on plantations, particularly in the Caribbean and South America, marking the beginning of centuries of exploitation and human suffering. The exchange of goods, wealth, and people across the Atlantic created the foundations of modern capitalism and laid the groundwork for the development of the global trade networks that would come to dominate the world in the centuries to follow. Columbus' legacy also extends into the realm of cultural exchange. While his voyages were primarily motivated by the search for wealth, Columbus' encounters with the Americas introduced new cultural ideas, practices, and materials to both the Old and New Worlds. The integration of New World crops into European agriculture revolutionized diets and food systems across Europe. Similarly, European technology and ideas began to have an impact on the Americas, albeit often through violent and coercive means. However, the cultural exchange was not purely one-sided. Over time, the encounter between the Old and New Worlds gave rise to new cultural forms, blending indigenous, African, and European influences. The development of mestizo and mulatto identities in Latin America is a testament to the complex and layered cultural exchanges that Columbus' voyages initiated. The intellectual impact of Columbus' voyages should not be overlooked. Columbus' challenge to establish geographic knowledge and his audacity in seeking new routes to Asia inspired generations of scholars and explorers. His voyages, though based on faulty assumptions about the size of the Earth and the location of Asia, demonstrated the possibilities of exploration and the need to reassess the known world. In doing so, Columbus contributed to the eventual rise of the scientific and geographic revolutions of the Renaissance. The age of exploration, spurred by Columbus' voyages, gave rise to advancements in navigation, cartography, and maritime technology that would influence the development of European empires and scientific thought in the centuries that followed. In conclusion, Columbus' legacy is multifaceted, complex, and at times contradictory. His voyages changed the world in profound ways, from expanding the geographic horizons of Europe to initiating a process of colonization that would reshape the Americas. While he is remembered for his role in the Columbian Exchange and the development of global trade, his impact on indigenous peoples and the legacy of European colonialism cannot be ignored. Columbus' achievements, while groundbreaking, were also tied to the exploitation and destruction of native cultures and the beginning of a long and painful chapter in world history. As history continues to evolve, Columbus' legacy remains a subject of ongoing debate and reflection, inviting future generations to grapple with both the remarkable and tragic consequences of his voyages. As the centuries have passed, the figure of Christopher Columbus has evolved from that of a heroic explorer to a more controversial and complex symbol of European colonialism. The changing perceptions of Columbus, particularly in the context of the modern world, offer a reflection of broader shifts in historical consciousness, power dynamics, and cultural narratives. For centuries, Columbus was lauded as a pioneer who bridged the gap between the old world and the new, initiating the age of exploration. Yet in recent decades, the legacy of Columbus has come under increasing scrutiny. This shift in perspective is indicative of the evolving nature of historical interpretation, which is deeply influenced by contemporary values, the recognition of indigenous rights, and a growing awareness of the consequences of European colonial expansion. In the immediate aftermath of Columbus' voyages, his accomplishments were celebrated in Europe, particularly in Spain and Italy, where Columbus became a national hero. His role in establishing European dominance in the Americas seemed to embody the triumph of European civilization over the unknown. Statues were erected in his honor, and his voyages were immortalized in books and art. Columbus Day, first recognized by the United States in 1792 and later made a federal holiday in 1937, symbolized the celebration of European exploration and the spread of Western ideals across the globe. Columbus was seen as a symbol of courage, vision, and perseverance, an icon of the drive to explore the unknown and to expand the boundaries of human achievement. However, as history progressed, the narrative surrounding Columbus began to change. One of the key factors contributing to this shift was the growing recognition of the devastating impact that European colonization had on indigenous populations. The arrival of Columbus in the Americas set in motion a chain of events that led to the near extermination of many native cultures. Indigenous peoples were subjected to violence, disease, enslavement, and the destruction of their way of life. The once idyllic image of Columbus as a harbinger of progress began to unravel as historians, scholars, and indigenous groups began to highlight the darker side of his legacy: the exploitation, violence, and forced conversion of the native populations. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a wave of critical reassessment emerged, questioning Columbus' role in the larger context of colonialism. Scholars increasingly focused on the long-term consequences of his voyages, particularly the displacement of indigenous peoples, the introduction of European diseases that decimated native populations, and the exploitation that characterized the early colonial systems in the Americas. Columbus' interactions with the indigenous peoples, often marked by violence, enslavement, and coercion, cast a long shadow over his image as a heroic figure. The growing recognition of the atrocities committed by European colonizers in the Americas led to a re-evaluation of Columbus as a historical figure, challenging the traditional narrative that had painted him as a benevolent explorer. This reassessment has led to a re-evaluation of Columbus' historical legacy, particularly in the Americas. In the United States, debates surrounding the celebration of Columbus Day have become increasingly polarized. While some still see Columbus as a symbol of European ingenuity and the beginning of the modern era, others have pushed for the holiday to be renamed Indigenous Peoples Day as a way of honoring the native communities whose lives and cultures were irrevocably altered by European colonization. In recent years, cities and states across the U.S. have removed statues of Columbus, citing the need to confront the painful history of colonization and its ongoing effects on indigenous peoples. These actions reflect a broader societal shift toward greater recognition of historical injustices and a re-evaluation of the figures who were traditionally celebrated in national narratives. One of the most significant elements of this shift is the rise of indigenous movements advocating for the recognition of their rights, sovereignty, and histories. The movement to change Columbus Day is part of a broader effort to reclaim indigenous narratives and challenge the dominant historical discourse that has often marginalized or silenced native voices. For many indigenous peoples, the arrival of Columbus is a symbol of the beginning of centuries of oppression, exploitation, and cultural erasure. The push for Indigenous Peoples Day represents a desire to honor the resilience and survival of indigenous cultures, while also acknowledging the historical trauma caused by European colonialism. In contrast, defenders of Columbus' legacy argue that his voyages should be understood in the context of the time in which they occurred. They contend that Columbus was a product of the Renaissance, a period characterized by exploration, discovery, and the expansion of European influence. From this perspective, Columbus is seen as an intrepid explorer who, despite his flawed understanding of the world, played a pivotal role in shaping the course of history. These defenders argue that his voyages should not be judged by modern standards, but rather placed in the broader context of the global events that were unfolding at the time. They suggest that his actions, while controversial, were part of the larger narrative of European exploration and the interconnectedness of the world that developed as a result. While these arguments hold weight, they are increasingly being challenged by the growing recognition that historical narratives are not fixed, but are shaped by the values and perspectives of the societies that construct them. The traditional view of Columbus as a hero has been critiqued as part of a Eurocentric narrative that has marginalized indigenous perspectives and ignored the long-lasting consequences of colonization. As historical scholarship becomes more inclusive and diverse, the story of Columbus has been reassessed to reflect a more nuanced understanding of the global impacts of his voyages. Furthermore, the legacy of Columbus is not only one of exploration and colonialism, but also one of cultural exchange, albeit one that came at a tremendous cost. The Columbian Exchange, as it came to be known, was the transfer of plants, animals, and ideas between the Old and New worlds. While the exchange of goods such as tobacco, potatoes, and maize had profound effects on global agriculture and cuisine, it also led to the introduction of diseases that decimated indigenous populations. The impact of the Columbian Exchange was transformative, creating a new world order that would shape the modern world. But it was also a source of immense suffering for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This duality in Columbus' legacy, both positive and negative, has led to ongoing debates about how he should be remembered. Is he a symbol of the triumph of European civilization, or a symbol of the destruction of indigenous cultures? Is he an explorer to be celebrated, or a figure whose actions should be critically examined in light of their consequences? As these debates continue, it becomes clear that Columbus' legacy cannot be easily reduced to a single narrative. His voyages were transformative in many ways, but they were also deeply destructive. The task for historians, policymakers, and citizens is not to erase Columbus from history, but to recognize the full complexity of his legacy and to engage with it in a way that acknowledges both the achievements and the harms of his voyages. In conclusion, the shifting views of Columbus reflect broader changes in historical scholarship, cultural narratives, and societal values. While Columbus has long been celebrated as a pioneering explorer, his legacy has become increasingly controversial in recent decades. The growing recognition of the devastating impact of European colonialism on indigenous peoples has led to a reassessment of Columbus' role in history. As society grapples with the complexities of historical memory, it is essential to confront the full scope of Columbus' legacy and to engage in a dialogue that incorporates diverse perspectives. Columbus, as both a symbol of exploration and a harbinger of colonialism, embodies the complexities and contradictions that define the history of European expansion and its lasting effects on the world. The figure of Christopher Columbus, though historically situated in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, remains a subject of profound relevance in the modern world. His voyages to the Americas marked the beginning of a new epoch in global history, shaping the cultural, economic, and political structures of both the Old and New worlds. Yet, as the world grapples with the legacies of colonization, global inequality, and the ongoing struggles for indigenous rights, Columbus has become emblematic of the tensions between progress and exploitation, discovery and devastation. The enduring debate surrounding Columbus today reveals deep divisions over how history should be remembered and whose voices should dominate historical narratives. Columbus is at the center of a contemporary discussion about the consequences of European colonialism, a legacy that has left a mark on societies worldwide. While some still view him as a hero of exploration, others argue that his actions initiated a destructive process that led to the displacement and decimation of indigenous populations. These contrasting viewpoints underscore the broader questions about the way history is constructed and the politics of memory. As modern societies reflect on their past, the debate surrounding Columbus serves as a catalyst for re-examining the foundational myths upon which nations have been built. In particular, Columbus voyages, once celebrated as the triumph of European ingenuity, are increasingly seen as part of a much larger, darker narrative of imperial conquest and exploitation. The central question in this debate is whether Columbus should be regarded as a symbol of discovery and progress or as a symbol of the beginning of centuries of exploitation. From the perspective of many indigenous peoples, Columbus represents the initial intrusion of foreign powers into their lands, bringing with it violence, disease, and cultural erasure. The devastation caused by European colonization in the Americas is well documented, with millions of indigenous people dying from diseases brought by the Europeans, forced labor, and violence. In this context, Columbus is often seen not as a figure of greatness, but as an agent of colonization who helped initiate one of the darkest chapters of human history. This viewpoint is at the heart of the growing movement to challenge the traditional glorification of Columbus, particularly in the Americas. The push for Indigenous Peoples Day, replacing Columbus Day, reflects the desire of indigenous communities to reclaim their narratives and challenge the historical injustices they have suffered. Many see Columbus as a symbol of European colonialism that continues to have profound effects on the lives of indigenous peoples, both in the Americas and across the world. For these communities, the commemoration of Columbus Day only reinforces a colonial mindset, perpetuating the marginalization and erasure of indigenous histories and cultures. However, defenders of Columbus' legacy argue that his actions, while undoubtedly flawed and contentious, should be viewed within the context of the time in which they occurred. From this perspective, Columbus was an explorer operating in an era when European expansion was driven by a desire for trade routes, wealth, and power. The age of exploration, marked by voyages of discovery, was a time of intense competition among European powers. Columbus' efforts, while misguided in some respects, were a product of Renaissance ideas about geography, science, and human progress. According to this view, Columbus should not be judged by modern standards, as his accomplishments in opening new trade routes between Europe and the Americas were groundbreaking for the time. Nonetheless, this defense of Columbus raises questions about how we evaluate historical figures and their actions. Is it enough to excuse historical wrongdoings by attributing them to the social and cultural norms of a given period? The modern world's understanding of human rights, social justice, and equity calls for a more critical examination of historical figures, particularly those whose actions resulted in the exploitation of marginalized peoples. The legacy of Columbus, like that of other explorers and conquerors, is entwined with the violence and subjugation of indigenous peoples. For many, these historical realities cannot be overlooked or justified by the prevailing attitudes of Columbus era. Another important aspect of the debate over Columbus' legacy is the role of historical memory in shaping national identities. In many countries, Columbus has long been celebrated as a founding figure, central to national myths of discovery, exploration, and expansion. In the United States, for example, Columbus has been elevated to the status of a national hero, with his voyages serving as a symbol of American exceptionalism and the expansion of Western civilization. This narrative has been reinforced through the establishment of Columbus Day as a national holiday and the creation of monuments in his honor. However, as new perspectives emerge and the historical narrative becomes more inclusive, these symbols of Columbus are increasingly being questioned. The reassessment of Columbus' role in history challenges the foundational myths upon which many modern societies are built. The controversy surrounding Columbus also speaks to broader issues of power and historical agency. The debate about Columbus is not just about the past. It is about who has the power to define history and shape collective memory. The voices of indigenous peoples who were silenced for centuries are now gaining prominence in discussions about the impact of colonization. Their experiences and perspectives are central to a more complete understanding of the past. In this sense, the modern re-examination of Columbus can be seen as part of a larger movement for decolonization, a process of questioning the legacies of imperialism and colonialism and working to dismantle the structures of power that continue to perpetuate inequality and injustice. As the debate about Columbus continues to evolve, it raises fundamental questions about how societies reconcile with their past. The reappraisal of Columbus' legacy does not require the erasure of his historical significance, but rather a more nuanced understanding of his place in history. Columbus was undeniably a product of his time, but the consequences of his actions are still felt today. The challenge lies in finding a way to engage with Columbus' legacy that acknowledges both his contributions to global exploration and the profound harm that European colonization caused to indigenous populations. This involves not only critiquing the glorification of Columbus, but also recognizing the need for reparative justice and reconciliation with the descendants of those affected by colonization. One of the key questions that arises from the modern debate over Columbus is the role of education in shaping our understanding of history. How do we teach the history of Columbus to future generations? Should we continue to celebrate his voyages? Or should we present a more balanced account of the consequences of his actions? Education plays a pivotal role in determining how history is remembered, and the way in which Columbus is taught will have a lasting impact on how future generations understand the complex legacies of European colonialism. A more inclusive approach to education could provide students with the tools to critically engage with historical narratives, encouraging them to consider multiple perspectives and question dominant myths. In conclusion, Columbus' legacy remains one of the most contested aspects of world history. His voyages opened up new worlds for European exploration, but they also set in motion a process of colonization that had devastating consequences for indigenous populations. As societies around the world come to terms with the legacies of colonialism, the figure of Columbus stands at the center of an ongoing debate about memory, identity, and justice. While some continue to view Columbus as a symbol of exploration and discovery, others see him as a symbol of oppression and exploitation. The debate surrounding Columbus reflects broader questions about how history is remembered, whose stories are told, and how the wounds of the past can be healed in the present. Ultimately, the story of Columbus serves as a reminder that history is not static and that our understanding of the past is always evolving.